I listened to a podcast where the coach described how she chooses her teams or selects talent. One of the major things that she emphasizes is the ability to learn, or a player who learns something quickly. And I think this is common amongst coaches. I think coaches tend to prefer players who can learn a new skill or learn a drill or immediately put something into practice quickly. But I think this can have a negative effect because learning is affected by many different factors. So for instance, a few years ago I coached a team and there were two Latino players on my team whose English wasn't their first language and who had never played on an organized team before. And so when I explained things, often they didn't understand immediately in the same way that the more experienced players could pick up and understood my language, both because of the English but also because of the basketball terminology. So the Latino players had grown up, kind of in a rec center and playing pickup ball and stuff like that, and were very good athletes who were trying to become basketball players, whereas the majority of the team had played basketball for a number of years. They understood basketball terminology, they had seen drills before, the same season or maybe the season before at the same place. There was one player who the JV coach almost cut from the freshman team because the player couldn't do a three-man weave. And it wasn't that he wasn't able to do a three-man weave, it's that he had never been on a team where he had learned how to do a three-man weave. So he was with a bunch of other players who had played organized basketball together and who, as soon as the coach said, all right, we're going to do a three-man weave, they knew what to do. They knew the basic patterns. Whereas this player really didn't understand. He saw people kind of moving in random formations as opposed to seeing and immediately understanding the pattern. And so does the fact that he can't do a three-man weave or he hasn't been exposed to a three-man weave before, does that say anything about his ability as a player? No, it just says that he has less experience than the other players. Or maybe he didn't see the pattern that other people saw because of that experience. Their previous experience allowed them to see the pattern that they should move into, whereas this player who had less experience in a formal setting, missed this pattern. And he actually had to learn it just like these players had probably learned it 3 or 4 or 5 years ago playing organized basketball. And so this player ended up being one of our better players, and he was almost cut just because he couldn't do a drill, because the perception might have been, well, he's a slow learner, he doesn't pick things up quickly, whereas the reality was he just hadn't been exposed to the basketball terminology in the same way that the other players had been exposed. The similar thing happened with the Latino players. They hadn't been exposed to the basketball terminology in the same way that the majority of the players on the team who had grown up playing, in more organized settings had coaching and had coaches use the same type of terminology that I was using as a coach. So this can cause a huge problem if you're cutting a player simply because they don't understand the language or they don't understand the terminology and therefore are deemed to be slower learners. It may not have anything to do with their ability to learn, their ability to perform some action on the court, and instead simply is experience. Players with more experience, more familiarity with the terminology and the expectations and kind of the culture of basketball versus somebody who's coming into that environment from a different angle with less exposure to that culture, that terminology that we have within the game. And so to me, to cut a player just because they don't understand the terminology, well, I think that's why they're joining a team, is so that they can learn. That's part of the learning experience, is to learn the terminology, to learn the drills, to learn the quote-unquote proper way to play the game. And if we just exclude those at a certain age because they haven't learned that already, well, now we're not necessarily picking talent. We're not necessarily picking players based on who learns quicker. We're just picking players based on who's been involved for the longest amount of time and therefore has had the most exposure to these terms and the most experience with different coaches. So they've probably had, learned all the different concepts. Whereas maybe a player who's only played for one coach learned a certain number of the concepts, but maybe was limited by only playing for one coach, and having never played for a coach, maybe only knows what they've heard on TV, or from friends at the park, and so on and so forth. So while I do agree that being able to learn quickly is a skill and does give a player an advantage, we have to be careful about how we're judging how a player learns. If I simply give a lot of verbal instructions to a group, some players may respond quicker or better to those verbal instructions, and some may not. That doesn't mean that the players who didn't respond as quickly or as well don't learn as quickly. Maybe if I only use a demonstration, the other ones would respond better. Maybe if I gave 3 or 4 minutes for them to try it on their own, a different group would excel with a little bit of trial and error, where maybe they didn't with just verbal instructions. And maybe those whose English isn't their first language, maybe with a demonstration with the instruction, maybe they learn just as well as another player whose English is their first language. So I think all these things factor into how we learn, how children learn. I also think certain expectations, the classes that people teach, or the expectations that teachers have for students. All these things factor into how a player learns on the basketball court. And to dismiss a player simply because we're going to say that one player learns something quicker than the other, in a short amount of time, and in the tryout period, I think that's a dangerous precedent. I do think learning is important. Obviously, if you have to explain something over and over and over and over again to one player, it's going to slow down a team, and so maybe that's a negative. But a lot of that can be related, again, to experience and exposure. And so, if that player shows the right enthusiasm, shows the right potential, maybe that just means that you have an assistant coach that spends a little bit more time with that player to help them catch up to the players who have more experience, as opposed to simply getting rid of that player just because they're not at the same experience level as the other players. So again, it's important how we differentiate what's actually learning, or the ability to learn something new, versus having a broader base of understanding because we have more experience or more exposure. We speak the same language, and some of these other cultural and social effects that affect the way that a player learns. So if we're going to choose players based on learning something new, we have to make sure that both sets, are actually learning something new, and it's not one person's learning something new versus somebody who's learning something that they know already. Because, of course, the person who already knows it is going to adapt or learn quicker than somebody who's learning for the very first time. So, again, it's not necessarily wrong to look at a player's ability to learn when choosing players for a team or making cuts, but we have to be careful about how we decide how a player learns and how quickly they learn and how quickly they can adapt and take something onto the court.